Well, happy Sabbath, children. Today we're going to
You didn't pin
do.
yourself.
I already did.
No, it's not showing up here.
Okay.
It's okay if it's on yours. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. Happy Sabbath, children. Today we're going to do our third part of Gladys Aylward. What an exciting adventure she had. So we left off with Gladys sharing the health message and the gospel side by side in the villages throughout the mountain province in China in the mid-1930s. And the Mandarin of the province had offered Gladys a job which would pay her so she could stay in China and share the gospel as she went, unbinding the little girl's feet. She was chosen because she was a woman, and she was the only woman in all of China with unbound Western feet. So only she could cross and walk to all these villages, because if your feet were bound, you were crippled. And then she set a really good example because they had never seen a foot that was normal. Can you imagine if your foot had been broken since you were a child and you'd never seen a normal foot? Like if you took your shoe off and looked at your foot, why, they had never seen a foot that looked like your foot. So God had used her to go unbind all the little children's feet. We also saw, like in this picture here, that there was an inn, the inn of 8 happinesses that Jenny and Gladys made. And that was for the muleteers to come in and hear the gospel. What an amazing way that God used Gladys Aylward. And we also learned the people learned to love her. They stopped calling her a white devil and instead called her Ai Weiwei, the virtuous one. It sounds like a great time, but oh, the trouble that was coming to China that we will see today and to Gladys. How would God work in hardship and in war? Well, let us see. Now, when Gladys was asked about her life in China and how she became a missionary, Gladys said, I wasn't God's first choice for what I've done in China. I don't know who it was. It must have been a man, a well-educated man. Maybe he died. Maybe he refused. I don't know what happened, but God looked down and saw Gladys Aylward, and God said, well, she's willing. During her second year in the mountain village of Yangqing, a violent riot erupted in the local men's prison. Convicts were rampaging in the courtyard. Several had been killed, and the armed guards were too terrified to intervene. The Mandarin, remember, he was the one that asked Gladys to go through the province and unbind the little girl's feet. Well, he summoned Gladys. The prison warden demanded she go inside and stop the riot. When a shocked Gladys asked, how could she possibly do that? The warden replied, you've been preaching that those who trust in the living God have nothing to fear. Realizing that backing down would compromise the gospel, she preached. That 4-foot, 10-inch woman walked through the gates into the prison, and she went in to face a bloody riot and dead men laying on the ground. She marched directly up to a massive prisoner wielding a blood-stained meat cleaver and commanded, give me that cleaver. Surprised by her sheer boldness, the man handed it over. Gladys then made the prisoners line up and tell her their grievances. She discovered they were rioting due to horrific overcrowding, starvation, and complete idleness. She successfully advocated more health reform to the Mandarin for prison reform, helping to install looms so the prisoners could weave cloth. You got to remember, they couldn't just go to Walmart back then and buy clothes. They had to make their own, and they had to make their own cloth. And so she got looms sent to the prison. and the prisoners learned how to weave cloth, and then they could sell the cloth to buy food and learn a trade. Many of the prisoners ultimately converted to Christianity through her bravery, and the Mandarin was astonished. A little while later, Gladys was visiting villages in that remote mountain province. After going to the very last village, she and her co-missionary partner, a physician named Dr. Hong, decided they should go further than they've ever gone before into the wilderness where there were no villages. They were compelled by God to keep going into the wilderness. And for 12 days, they pressed on. They ran out of food and they were very hungry, but they were compelled to keep going. Dr. Hong went on ahead to scout out the area more. She was alone as she walked through the mountains and decided to sing hymns out loud as she walked. Hidden in the high mountain cliffs, unknown to Gladys, was a Buddhist monastery carved into the cliffs. Years earlier, one of the monks had found a stray Christian gospel tract in a market town. It contained the verse John 3:16. Children, do you know that verse? Have you memorized it? Could you say it out loud? Do you know it as, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not die, but have everlasting life"? The Lamas had been utterly captivated by the concept of a supreme God who loves, rather than the countless deities who need to be appeased with fear. For years, the monks had been praying for this living God to send a messenger to explain this verse and the rest of the Bible to them. The monks heard Gladys singing as she walked through the mountains, and the High Lama sent for her, stating that only people who truly know God will sing, and recognizing her as the promised messenger. Because think about it, those monks, they weren't very glad. They lived all alone up there. They had a very sad life, and it was unusual to hear someone singing with such joy. So this was like a mark of God. So they welcomed Gladys and her co-missionary companion, and Dr. Hong preached the gospel, and Gladys sang to the 500 lamas, and there had never, ever been a woman in the monastery. So God had a plan for those men. One by one, over the night they spent there, the lamas would come up to Gladys and Dr. Hong, asking questions about this God they served. They never knew if any or how many accepted the gospel, but they hoped seeds were planted and they would grow. In the spring of 1938, the Second Chinese-Japanese War reached her region. Japanese bombers heavily bombed Yangchang, killing thousands, forcing survivors to flee into the mountains. Did Gladys go with them to safety? No, she would say, "These are my people. God has given them to me, and I will live or die with them for him and his glory." So Gladys stayed behind in that ruined village, pulling people from the rubble, tending to the wounded, and transformed her into a hospital. There were hundreds of thousands of refugees coming through her village, wave after wave of hungry, lost people. And as they moved through, there were always orphans left behind. Gladys had already adopted 5 as her own children, with 9pence and Lost being the first 2. But then more came, and then more, and eventually she would have 100 children to care for. Because of her intimate knowledge of the mountain passes, Gladys actively assisted the Chinese nationalist forces, passing intelligence on about the Japanese troop movements, When the Japanese discovered her work for China, they placed a huge bounty on her head, circulating handbills and posters for her capture, dead or alive. The Japanese army became very ruthless and cruel, and they would surely have killed the orphans and Gladys if they got the opportunity. It's a good lesson for us to remember that as times get really hard and we see war and all this sorrow going on, that God is with us and he will protect us just like he did Gladys. The Mandarin of Yangcheng had long appreciated Gladys, having previously hired her as the official food inspector and witnessed her supernatural courage during the prison riot and her selfless sacrificial love during the Japanese bombings. The Mandarin was drawn to her true faith and love for the living God. Before the city fell to the Japanese, the Mandarin gathered the remaining citizens for a farewell feast. He publicly renounced his religion, his Confucianist religion, and he would be converting to Christianity, stating he wished to make Ai Weiwei's faith his very own. He didn't just convert. He left all the religion of Confucianism and 4,000 years of tradition of their style of worship to their many countless little gods. He didn't worship both systems. He left the superstitions and practices that offended the God of heaven and earth, the living God, and took on the religion of Christianity. He did not blend them. In the Bible, we read in Ephesians 4:5, one God, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in you all. Wow, this came as a great shock to the villagers who watched. They had never seen such a thing before. With the Japanese army closing in and a price on her head, Gladys knew the roughly 100 orphans under her care would be slaughtered or enslaved. She determined to lead them to a government orphanage in Siam, hundreds of miles away. The journey over the ragged mountains lasted 27 days. The children ranged in age from 2 to 15 years old. Many of the girls had their feet unbound just a few years prior, so they were crippled walking through the mountains, carrying toddlers on them as they went. They walked barefoot or with rags tied around their feet. They hid in bushes from Japanese planes. They slept right on the ground. Food ran out, and they survived on wild plants and the occasional miraculous kindness of passing Chinese soldiers. The exhausted group reached the banks of the massive Yellow River. To Gladys's horror, all civilian boat traffic had been halted, and boats were hidden or destroyed to prevent the Japanese from advancing. They were entirely trapped against the riverbank. Despondent, Gladys began to weep. 3 days they waited by the river, hoping for help to get across it. One teenage girl asked Gladys, "Why hasn't God parted the Yellow River like he did the Red Sea?" Gladys snapped, "I'm not Moses." The teenage girl said, "But God is still God, and he can do anything. Ask him to part the waters like he did for Moses." Admonished by her faith, Gladys gathered the 100 children to kneel in the dirt by the river. They prayed and began loudly singing hymns. For 3 days they waited, watching for help. Nothing. But after the prayer, a Chinese nationalist officer patrolling the opposite side of the Yellow River heard the singing echoing over the water. He rowed across to investigate. Stunned by the sight of a small woman and her army of orphans, he signaled a hidden military boat to ferry Gladys and every single child across the river. Now that they were across the Yellow River, they were still in great danger. Japanese planes were patrolling the area constantly. They were able to get onto a train. However, Japanese bombers had blown out a major rail ahead. To bypass the destruction, Gladys and the children had to get off the train and painfully hike over another mountain range to catch a different train on the other side. When they reached the next rail line, they found there were no passenger trains available, only military transports and freight lines. The area was active with Japanese patrols and reconnaissance planes. How were they going to go any further? How would God work now? Well, there was one train left, a coal train. Why, there weren't any cars on it for passengers. It carried only coal. Lacking money or any passenger transport, Gladys and the children were crowded onto the back of the train, not in it, but on top of the open, filthy coal cars. And if you don't know anything about coal, well, the train itself produced a horrific smell itself. But then the coal was quite stinky. It was a sickening kind of stinky. It wasn't fun. You kids might think, oh, that sounds like fun, riding on top of a coal train. But it was actually quite miserable. However, the coal saved them. The Japanese saw the coal car, but not the 100 children and Gladys covered in black soot from the coal. And they were hungry and thirsty and sick and cold and weak in a miserable ride. But something so awful God would use to be their saving grace. It's something to remember as God works in our lives. Sometimes the great discomforts are actually great blessings. They rode for days, exposed to the elements, covered in black coal soot. Japanese bombers saw the coal train, but they wanted the coal, so they didn't bomb it. If they had seen the 100 refugees hidden in the coal, they surely would have bombed it. As smelly, miserable, cold as it was a great blessing. The train was carrying them further from the Japanese army, faster than their worn-out little bodies and blistered feet and starving bellies could have carried them. They met great disappointment soon after getting off the train and walking to Sian. They had made it. Sian was the official destination Gladys had been aiming for throughout the entire month-long trek. In her mind, she kept saying, if we could just make it to Sian. As she understood, a government orphanage was operating there. The name of the city meant peace, but they would find no peace there. When Gladys and her blackened, starving army of children finally arrived at the gates of Sian, they were met with the devastating news. The city was completely closed. They were refused to enter. It was overwhelmed by an influx of refugees. Fearing severe food shortages, lawlessness, and disease, the city guards blocked the gates, turned Gladys and the 100 children away. Oh, can you imagine how discouraged you would have been? Look how far these children had come, and they shut the gates on them. Heartbroken, physically fading, Gladys refused to give up. She pushed the children further west into the province, traveling towards the city of Fufeng, whose name meant support, protect, lift up. The city welcomed them all, immediately coming out and giving them clean clothes and food and medical attention. Miraculously, despite walking for nearly a month through the mountains and war zone, not a single child died or was left behind. It was only after Gladys watched the very last child cross the threshold of Fufeng that she fell to the ground. Suffering from 105-degree fever, typhus, pneumonia, a bullet wound in her back, she collapsed into a deep coma. They carried her to a makeshift hospital where she lay for days unknown to anyone. She was completely unrecognizable. Someone had heard about the miraculous journey through the mountains, through enemy fire, and knew who Gladys was. He had met her. So he went looking throughout the entire city for her, and he couldn't find her. Even when he went into the hospital and he looked at every person in the cot, he still didn't recognize her. The Chinese doctor had to take him to her cot and said, "Yes, this is Gladys." That's how sick she was. He found her completely shriveled up, frail and sick. It took weeks for her to get the strength. Gladys would often say Philippians 4:13, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." Oh, what a wonderful verse to remember. 1941 through 1948, she continued working in Western China. She recovered her health. She refused to go home to the comforts of England. And while her old village of Yangcheng was a war zone, she moved further into China. And for nearly a decade, she started new churches, worked in a leper colony, aided war refugees, and continued sharing the gospel. But by 1949, the Communist Party officially established the People's Republic of China, and they began hunting down, imprisoning, or killing foreign missionaries. Recognizing her presence was putting her Chinese brothers and sisters in mortal danger, Gladys was forced to leave her home and return to England. To close our story, let us remember that Gladys was rejected as a missionary by men. She was told while in China that God does not use women in missionary field alone, but she would say, God does not use golden vessels or silver vessels, but yielded vessels. Our closing scripture is 2 Corinthians 4:7. But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. Amen.
Wow. Is there still another part?